Welcome back to That's Helpful with me, Ed Stott. It is your weekly serving of science-backed self-improvement. Now today, an area of sleep that you may not have considered but could really be throwing you off. We all know how essential a good night's sleep can be for our health, but whilst we might be prioritising our bedtime routine, lavender-scented room spray and not using screens before bed, our partners may actually be the thing that's costing us a perfect night's sleep. Whether they are a champion snorer, elite level fidgeter, or they just have a completely different sleep schedule to you, it doesn't take much to knock off our 8 hours. So what can we do about it? How can we sleep better in a couple? And is it time for a sleep divorce? Well, Dr. Wendy is a licensed clinical psychologist specially trained in sleep medicine and a senior behavioural scientist at the Rand Corporation think tank. She's the author of Sharing the Covers, Every Couple's Guide to Better Sleep. Wendy, thank you so much for joining me. Why is this such an area of interest for you?
Well, I've been fascinated by the topic of sleep and sleep in couples for over the past 20 years. And I think what really fascinates me about it is, well, first, everything about sleep is fascinating. And when I first started studying sleep, I was really struck by the idea, and it was kind of a basic idea I had, which was, okay, here we spend about 1/3 of our lives asleep. That's if we're lucky and we get the roughly 8 hours of sleep per night that our bodies and brains need to function optimally. And for most adults, that 8 hours per day is spent with a partner. And yet the vast majority of sleep research had never even considered sort of the impact of the bed partner on one's sleep or how one's sleep affects the couple's relationship quality. So I thought it was this hugely neglected area. And as somebody who's interested in both the mysteries of sleep and also the mysteries of love and relationships, I just thought it was, a perfect marriage of two lines of research.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Because like you say, most of us, or a lot of us at least, would be going to bed with somebody else in our bed, but we just don't even consider the impact that has on us. What does the research that has been done say about whether or not we sleep better together or separately?
That research is really quite fascinating as well. And it's really not a huge literature by any means, but here's what we know. When we measure couples' sleep objectively, let's say we put a wristwatch monitor on them to track their sleep, or we measure their brain activity at night, and we measure them while sleeping with their partner or while sleeping alone. Interestingly enough, this existing studies that have looked at this have generally shown that when you share a bed with a partner, you generally sleep somewhat worse when sharing a bed as opposed to sleeping alone. But what's really interesting about this is that when you then ask those same people, do you prefer to sleep with your partner or do you prefer to sleep alone? Now, most people will say, despite those objective consequences that the sleep trackers may show, most people will say that they prefer to sleep with their partner. So this suggests that there's this discrepancy between what our objective measures of sleep might show and our subjective experience of sleep. And what I find most fascinating about this is it really speaks to our need as human beings to feel safe and secure in order to fall asleep. And we as human beings are social beings. And the primary way that we feel safe and secure is through our connections with others. And so even though there might be some objective costs to sharing a bed, we generally prefer that psychological comfort of sleeping next to a loved one.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. I bet that resonates with so many people when they hear that. And what does the research say about how men and women, I know there's many more genders on the spectrum now, but men and women specifically, how do we experience sleep differently?
There's a number of levels where men and women sleep differently, and that becomes really interesting when you look at heterosexual pairs. So first of all, generally speaking, men are at greater risk for certain sleep disorders like sleep apnea. So to put it bluntly, men are more likely to be kind of loud sleepers. They're more likely to snore.
Yeah.
Women, on the other hand, are more likely to be kind of light sleepers, or at least to experience their sleep as more light, more disrupted, have poor quality sleep. Women are, in fact, twice as likely as men to have the clinical disorder of insomnia. So that's a really interesting pairing when you put the sex that tends to be louder sleepers, men, with a female sex who tends to be at greater risk for insomnia. That can create some specific challenges among couples. And surely that's a sort of pairing that I see quite frequently in my clinical practice. Men and women also have other differences as well. Women actually tend to sleep better objectively as compared to men. Again, when we hook them up with various, measure brain waves, measure movement at night, women actually objectively sleep better and longer than men. And yet again, women experience their sleep as poorer sleep quality. And if you ask any woman sort of how she experiences her sleep, what you will often hear, and I hear this again all the time in my clinical practice, is a woman will say, yeah, well, I might have been asleep, but my brain just will never shut off. And so it's that experience of being asleep and yet never being able to turn your brain off. This it is very characteristic of women, and particularly women after they have had children, which makes a lot of sense from an evolutionary standpoint, that women who have traditionally been the primary caretakers of children and more responsible for the nighttime caregiving duties, that after you have children, even once they've grown and they're no longer needing you in the middle of the night, many women have that sort of conditioned vigilance response where they can be awakened by any little thing at night where their husband or partner sleeps soundly through it all, perhaps snoring as he does. Yes, and there's a lot of eye rolling happening among the many women who are experiencing this.
Oh, yeah, 100%, because it's just like, again, another area of our lives when women are asleep, they're still taking on more responsibility than men, which is why I'm rolling my eyes so viciously.
Perfectly well stated.
Yeah, right.
The woman who does too much 24 hours a day, including while asleep.
Oh, yes, it is very, very familiar. And so what does the research say about the benefits that actually come from sharing a bed with your partner and sleeping together?
That literature is actually very small, almost non-existent. Right. And what I can tell you, though, is, it really depends on the couple. As I said already, in general, there is research to show that people generally psychologically feel like they sleep better with a partner, though that's not true for, every couple. Believe me, there's many couples who have just decided, both from an objective standpoint and psychologically, they just prefer to sleep apart. So what the research is really now showing is that there's a great deal of variability across couples. Some do feel a sense of safety, security, and comfort, and that closeness from sharing a bed. And I think for others, particularly when the objective sleep disturbances get to a certain level, then it becomes sort of, those psychological benefits seem to sort of be less important, because at the end of the day, what people really want is just to sleep. So I think that that's really the challenge that many couples are now more and more facing head on. Because as you said at the beginning, the reality is we just have a lot of assumptions about how couples should sleep together. And it's not necessarily born out of the research. So I think what's happening now is couples are actually starting to evaluate and be intentional about thinking about, okay, what is it? What are the benefits I derive from sharing a bed with my partner? And what are the possible consequences? And if those consequences start to outweigh the benefits, then maybe for that couple, some other options might be available, such as, separate beds, separate bedrooms on a temporary basis or permanent. So I think couples are more and more realizing that there's not a one size fits all sleeping strategy. And if they're someone, or if they're in a couple who does experience the benefits of sleeping together, then that's wonderful. And there are many. You get the psychological closeness, you have the physical closeness, the opportunity for intimacy, which may be more challenging if you're sleeping apart, though certainly not impossible. There's also some physiological benefits of sharing a bed, such as sort of the stress relieving hormones like oxytocin that can be released when you have physical closeness with another. So there can be many benefits, but that's not to say it's true for all people. And for those people, I think it's really important to really realize, so what's the impact on your sleep? Because we know that matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And historically, we haven't always shared a bed in the way that we do now and the way we expect to do now, have we?
That's absolutely correct. I mean, the pendulum has really shifted back and forth throughout history with at times stigma attached to sleeping together. And, nowadays there's stigma attached to sleeping apart, although we're actually starting to see that shift some too. So we've all seen images, on, Netflix shows like The Crown, where, in Victorian England, the king and queen and those who could afford it always slept apart. It was really a sign of prestige to be able to sleep apart, and was also considered more hygienic because there were a lot of beliefs sort of in the olden days about diseases being spread through, foul smells like your partner's morning breath. And so there was really this, sort of impetus to sleep apart, supported by sort of these half-baked science ideas of the time. And actually what's really interesting is, even in contemporary society with the COVID pandemic, that was another time where we saw the pendulum shift. And we actually started seeing couples who sort of had this natural experiment of having to sleep apart. Let's say one partner is a medical professional and comes home from the hospital and doesn't want to potentially expose their bed partner, to any COVID infection that they might have been exposed to. So many couples were, for safety reasons, to reduce the spread of infection, choosing to sleep apart on a temporary basis during COVID. And so this was also, for some couples, this aha moment where they thought, oh, they never would have tried this, sleeping arrangement in the past. But lo and behold, they actually both started sleeping better and then treating each other, better during the day. And so they thought, oh, well, maybe the stigma that we now have attached to sleeping apart, maybe that doesn't actually apply to us if it means we're actually sleeping better.
Yeah, like you say, how we sleep does have a direct correlation in terms of how good our relationship is and how well we treat each other, right? How important is sleep to a good relationship?
That's really the question I want people to focus on. And that's really the focus of my book. And most of my research over the past 20 years is really looking at how powerful sleep can impact the quality of our close relationships. And that research is quite clear. What we and others have shown is that a well-slept person is happier, funnier, more attractive, a better communicator, and more empathic towards their partner. In contrast, when we're not getting the sleep we need, or in studies where people are sleep deprived in a laboratory setting, we see increases in conflict in a sort of marital context. We also see an increase in the particular types of behaviors that marital researchers have identified as being the really toxic behaviors that are associated with divorce in relationship. So things like being hostile and overly critical. We see an increase in those toxic behaviors when people are not getting the sleep they need. So sleep is absolutely fundamental, not only for our own individual well-being and physical health and performance, but also our relationship health.
Yeah, fascinating. So interesting. And so what are some of the signs that we might be better off sleeping separately? You said there it's all about that balance of how well you sleep versus those benefits that you do get from sleeping in the same bed. But when might it be time to consider whether or not we're doing the best thing by sleeping in the same bed?
That's a really good question. And that's, it really all begins with some sort of introspection about sort of what's working, what's not working in the bedroom. And, identifying sort of like, first of all, how well are you sleeping? And really being open to the many possibilities that it's not all about your partner necessarily. There might be many causes. If you're not sleeping well, there could be many causes for sleep problems. And so we want to really go down the list, make sure your sleep environment is, optimizing sleep in terms of light, sound, temperature. Make sure you don't have other sleep disorders, such as sleep apnea or insomnia that are, directly interfering with your sleep. But then also considering, what is the impact of my bed partner on my sleep, because we do know that bed partner sleep is interdependent. So, if your partner is moving around quite a bit in the middle of the night, that will also affect, your movements and the quality of your sleep. So I think sort of identifying sort of what is the source of the problem, might there be other factors as well, and then being willing to have an open and honest conversation with your partner. What's really interesting is I have a lot of couples who come into, my clinical practice, and, one partner will be really struggling with insomnia. So often it's a female, but not always, but she'll have difficulty falling asleep or difficulty staying asleep or just poor, non-refreshing sleep quality. And she will be convinced that it's all about her partner. And so she just basically wants me to say, I'm giving you guys permission to sleep apart. Yeah. And what's really interesting is that it's, sometimes that might be the solution, but we never just jump to that. In fact, my suggestion to couples is, if you're considering sleeping apart, consider it on a trial basis. Experiment with different sleeping arrangements, because that's a lot less threatening to both partners. And by the way, you might also learn something. So in my clinical experience, sometimes when, a couple come in and, one partner is convinced, if only, I could sleep apart, then my sleep problems will go away. Sometimes that may be true, but not always. And sort of by being willing to just experiment with a temporary sleeping apart strategy, sometimes that individual will learn, oh, this is not all about my partner. Maybe I have to start doing some of my own work on my own insomnia. And that's what's really driving the problem. In other cases, they may find, oh, wow, this trial basis of sleeping apart, it wasn't the end of our relationship. It wasn't the end of our sex life. And by the way, we actually started treating each other better the next day. And so that was actually beneficial for our sex life and our relationship life in general. So it's these sort of experimental processes that kind of destigmatize, even the idea of sleeping apart. And it gives couples the opportunity to test it out without feeling like, oh, we're, signed up for this for the rest of our lives, even if it doesn't work for us. It's really sort of taking away the judgment and really just trying out, wow, what can we do to optimize both of our sleep? Because we definitely know that when we're both sleeping better, we can be better partners to each other. And that should really be the focus within couples.
Yeah, absolutely. And it doesn't have to be, separate bedrooms all the time, always sleeping apart, does it? There's like a sliding scale of things that you can do to kind of start experimenting with this. Could you share some ideas with us as how, if it feels like a big leap to start sleeping completely separately, what we might be able to start doing to gradually change that scale?
Absolutely. And the first thing I want to say is, I in no way am prescriptive about any of this. I am absolutely not saying couples should sleep together or apart. Rather, I want us to sort of do away with the idea of shoulds when it comes to one of the most intimate and important health behaviors that couples engage in, which is sleep. So couples need to arrive at this decision on their own without sort of society's messaging, social media messaging, your parents' messaging, your neighbors' messaging, your friends. This is really your decision. And, it really comes down to, what the problem might be with your shared sleep. If it's a matter of, your partner who's tossing and turning, or is a sheet stealer, you might want to try a strategy such as the Scandinavian method, which is essentially two twin beds put together equals a king, but it allows you both to have individualized bedding preferences. You can have your own sheets so your partner can't steal them. You can even, some couples who have different temperature preferences, one likes it hot, the other likes it cold. You can sort of individualize those preferences. You can even have different mattress firmnesses. So again, those types of problems might be solved through the Scandinavian method. If it's an issue of snoring, that's where, when it's a sound intrusion that's really disrupting the one partner's sleep. First of all, the first strategy is to, get your partner treated and make sure that the snoring isn't a sign of some significant sleep disorder like sleep apnea, which it can be. So that's really the most important thing to do, before jumping to separate beds. Short of separate beds, you can certainly try other noise reducing strategies like wearing earplugs. And there's a million different varieties out there. And it's really about finding the type that's going to be comfortable to you. You can use a sound machine. You can try the technique of going to bed before your partner, so that you're at a deeper stage of sleep before they come in and start snoring. And, if that doesn't work, you could do this sort of trial episode of sleeping apart temporarily. Some couples will do this sort of when the stakes are high during the week, when they have to wake up for work in the morning and sleep is really important. And they're starting to get aggravated with their partner when they're not sleeping well. Maybe you try sleeping apart during the work week and then reuniting on the weekend. And many couples find that very sort of sexy and romantic, and it can kind of spice things up. And by the way, they're getting better sleep during the week. And then the final thing that I see a lot that does require sort of different arrangements is when couples are on different sleeping patterns. And this is really where negotiation is key. You might be a morning lark who wakes up naturally at the crack of dawn, and you might be married or partnered with somebody who is more of an evening type. And what couples often do is, because they ascribe to this idea that couples have to or should, go to bed at the same time and wake up at the same time, what you often find is that one partner is sort of being dragged along the sleep schedule of the other. And they're essentially trying to override their biology, which you cannot do. So if you're an extreme evening type and your partner is going to bed at 10 p.m., you're not, as an evening type, even sleepy at that time. And so what can happen is you lie there in bed awake, you get frustrated. And for some people, that's where insomnia starts, because you're essentially trying to override your biology which tells you when you should be sleepy. So for those couples, I really recommend some behavioral strategies, which is, talk about sort of your preferences for morningness, eveningness, your ideal bedtimes. And what you don't want to do is sacrifice that critical time in bed before one of you falls asleep. So if you're on totally different sleep schedules, allow the early bird type to go to bed earlier. Maybe you spend some time together in bed. And when it's the early bird's bedtime, the night owl can get out of bed, go to another room, continue their evening, and quietly return to bed when it's their more natural bedtime. So it's just another example of couples needing to sort of address what's going on for them and for their couple, instead of just ascribing to these ideas of what all couples should do when it's not necessarily working for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think if one of you is like a really morning person and the other person's a nighttime person, because of the stigmas that we have in society around people who stay up later, like it's always seen as like, oh, you're super productive, you're on it, you're, one of those people who's an absolute go-getter if you're a morning person. And then if you like to get up a little bit later, we kind of have this perception that, oh, you're a bit lazy, you're probably staying up late because you're drinking or, doing something that's not very good for you, when in actual fact, lots of people just work better in the evening.
Yes, we treat being a morning person like it's some sort of virtue.
Yeah.
And it is not. It is just, it's 50% genetically determined whether you're, a extreme morning person or an extreme, night person. Most of us are actually sort of these third birds in the middle. But they're really, this idea that, the morning people are just naturally more sort
Yeah.
of vigorous, better people. That's again, a societal idea, not born in reality. And, evening types are just as creative, just as productive. It's just at a different time of day, and it doesn't work for them when we sort of drag them along, including in a partnership, with the biology of the other person. And it's just, those two things are just not aligned. So the work of the couple is to really recognize those individual biological differences and hopefully sort of maximize those differences, and then work together so that you still have shared time together. In fact, there's, some evidence that for couples, that there might be like some level of evolutionary benefit for mismatched pairs. For instance, when
Yes.
rearing children, if you're a morning bird and you're fortunate enough to be married to or partnered with a supportive night owl partner, let them take the nighttime duties. You can really maximize your differences and, by negotiating, sort of put those differences to work for you rather than against you. And that's what healthy couples do. They recognize their differences at and this is at the level of biology, but they allow that to work for them instead of trying to, put down the other person or drag the other person along and try to override that biology, which simply won't work.
Yeah, really interesting, isn't it? Especially when we actually look at where these ideas come from, and often they're backed by nothing other than just our own expectations. It's really interesting.
Yes, much more sort of societally based beliefs and expectations rather than anything born in science, which is why it's been so important to me over the past 20 years to really do systematic study of sort of the role of sleep in couples relationships, and ultimately to write the book so that it was accessible to people and to give people real tools of, how to navigate that, a third of our lives we spend asleep with or without our partner. Because it's just largely been neglected. We just assume that just because you fall in love with someone, you automatically are going to be completely compatible with them for, a third of your life. That's a lot. It's asking a lot.
Yeah, it really is, especially when, it's so different. Especially when we, are, my husband, he gets angry because I say he's not a morning person, but he actually gets up around 7, but I just get up at like 5 ridiculously early.
You're
He's
an
like,
extreme morning person.
Yeah, I'm an extreme morning person. And he's like, you keep telling people I'm not a morning person. I am a morning person. Like, other people consider that to be a morning person. Anyway, on that, you kind of talk about the fact that we should see sleep less as like an individual act and more as a social behavior. What do you mean by that?
There's really a number of levels where we can start to think about sleep in a social context. First of all, and this again, a far cry from where the world of sleep research began, and sleep is a pretty young field in general. It's been around for about 70 or so years. And
Yeah,
we
wow.
started, yeah, so it's from a medical standpoint, it's a really young field, and when when sleep research, sort of the pioneering work first began, it was all focused on the individual under these tight, rigidly controlled, isolated conditions in the laboratory. But that's really not how sleep occurs in the real world. Sleep in the real world is often happening in a social environment, that is with a partner or maybe with children. It's, the communities we live in matter for sleep. So we know from some research that I and others have done that, even the quality of your neighborhoods and the conditions of your neighborhood can impact your sleep. So if you live in a neighborhood that you feel unsafe in, or there's high levels of crime, or maybe there's a lot of light pollution or noise pollution, those neighborhood factors can influence your sleep. Even the policies under which we live can influence our sleep. So it's really sort of expanding the lens from where sleep research began, that it was this, isolated individual behavior, to now recognize that no, like sleep is deeply embedded in these multiple levels of our social environments. And it also means that there's opportunity to intervene at multiple levels. It's not just, yes, individual level interventions are important, but when you see the magnitude of the problem we have in society with insufficient sleep and sleep problems, we also need to be addressing some of these bigger population level factors that contribute to sleep. Including, some things, even changing environments. And climate change is going to be a big thing in the future with regard to our sleep, in a climate that's warming. It's again, expanding the lens is not such an individual behavior anymore, but it's impacted by our social and physical environments as well.
Yeah, really interesting. We just do not think about it in that way at all. But you're so right. When you start to think about it, if you ever, I used to have an apartment that was really, really light. It was impossible to get to sleep without wearing an eye mask, and then the eye mask would disturb you. Or even, really loud apartments that make you feel a bit unsafe, again, it really affects your sleep, and you just don't think about it. And that's, from a very privileged position, I chose to live in those places. But, still, you don't even think about how it impacts your sleep. It's so interesting.
Yes, and that, of course, also is implicated in what we're also seeing, which is that there are pretty striking differences in sleep patterns across different, social groups in society. So we see people from, low-income communities, as well as individuals from minoritized racial and ethnic groups, showing higher rates of sleep disturbances and insufficient sleep duration. And it's, again, likely due to sort of multi-level factors that are causing this, including sort of lack of resources, exposure to discrimination, and the environments that, when you have constrained resources, that are not conducive to healthy sleep.
Yeah, and when you think about the impact that sleep has on our health and our relationships and our mood and our mental health, that is quite a shocking discrepancy, isn't it?
It really is. And it's really, I think, been eye-opening for many people as the world and the field of sleep has really grown, and the research on the profound impact of sleep on so many different health outcomes, ranging from risk for heart disease to certain cancers to Alzheimer's disease, and certainly to all sorts of mental health problems. We really now are seeing sleep as part of the pathway that might contribute to these profound disparities in these health outcomes. Sleep is, really contributing, and insufficient sleep and poor sleep is contributing to these striking disparities we see in health outcomes. Now, the good news is sleep is a modifiable behavior, and there are things we can do to improve sleep. And by doing so, we can hopefully improve health and promote health equity as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Super interesting. And so I guess on a bit of a social level, but less of a social level than that, you touched on it a bit. What about things like if we have dogs in the bed or pets in the bed, or like you said, children who like to come in the bed? Like, is it important that if they are disruptive, we kind of take control of that situation too and don't think, that this is just the way it is?
Yes. I do cover chapters on this in my book too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the best place to start with this question, which is true for many people and an issue for many people, is to first sort of kind of draw from the theoretical framework, which I apply to all my work, of sort of why we prefer to sleep with another, even if sometimes it comes with objective costs, and whether that other is our partner or our pet or our child, and why our children prefer to sleep with their parents. We really need to think about sleep from an evolutionary standpoint. It's a very vulnerable state to be in, right?
Yeah.
You're lying down, your eyes are closed, you're sort of vulnerable to potential threats from the environment, at least in our evolutionary past. And yet we need to downregulate vigilance and alertness in order to fall asleep. And as I said before, as human beings, we're social beings. And one of our sort of hardwired ways to derive a sense of safety and security is through our connections with close others, whether that be a partner or a pet or a child. And so I think first understanding, why there might be that psychological sort of pull towards, wanting to, have your pet sleep with you, and many people really love sharing a bed with their pet. And, if they're good sleepers, I say, have at it, go for it. The problem becomes, yeah. So, the problem becomes if it's really disrupting your sleep, if your dog or your cat is, crawling all over you at night, is having nightmares, or if you're allergic, pet dander can cause sleep disordered breathing, then you might want to think about alternatives. But recognizing that sort of motivation to, cuddle with, some, in this case, a pet that you feel close to, that's really understandable. And similarly with children, the fact that children, may resist sleeping apart from their parents, that's also kind of really natural. Now, just because it's natural doesn't mean it's going to work for you and your family. And what I encourage families to recognize is, that's a family choice. If you want your child to sleep independently, eventually, that is a perfectly okay and understandable and healthy family choice. But you cannot expect your child to just flip a switch and, if they've been sleeping with you, for nights and nights or years and years, when you decide that you want them to sleep independently, it's really understandable that they're going to have some resistance to that because, again, they also want those feelings of safety and security. And so for children, it's really about predictability and consistency in their sleep patterns. And, if they've been sleeping with you up until a certain point and you change your mind and you want them to sleep in their own bed, it does not mean that it's permanent, that you're never going to make that change. Plenty of families do. It's just don't expect it to happen overnight. Of course, that child is going to resist some because they were deriving a sense of safety and security while sharing a bed, but it's not working for you anymore. And so the change needs to happen, but know that it's going to be a process.
Yeah. And I guess, again, keeping in mind those benefits to a relationship if you are getting enough sleep, because surely if you're getting enough sleep, you're being a better parent, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's when, a lot of families who are somewhat ambivalent about, whether they want their, child in bed, whether it bothers them or not, they start to realize, well, this kid is keeping me up at night, every night coming in at 3 a.m. It starts to, that can create, just as, a snoring partner or a partner who thrashes around at night can, if that, anger or resentment is starting to build because you're not getting the sleep you need, then that's when you really need to take stock and say, okay, what are we doing? And it may be a challenge. It may be a process to change, our current sleeping pattern, but it absolutely can be done. And it's worth it because the negative impact on our mood, our irritability, our communication skills is, it's most acutely felt in those family relationships. And the last thing we want to do is be taking out our irritable, angry, sleep deprived selves on our loved ones. So that's why it's so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Wendy, this is so fascinating. I love it when you get a different perspective on something that you just assumed is the way that everything has to work. It's really, really interesting. If people only take one thing from our conversation about sleep and when it comes to sleep as a couple or in a family, what's the one thing you want them to take away from our conversation?
I think that the most important thing to recognize is that we all have different sleep needs and sleep preferences. But sort of whoever we are, the one commonality is we all do need good, healthy sleep. And that's sleep that's of sufficient duration and good quality. And that's pretty regular, consistent sleep on a nightly basis. We absolutely need that for our own individual health and well-being and for our ability to be, a good partner, a good parent, a good friend. So we owe it not only to ourselves, but also to the people we love to make sleep a priority and be open to making changes in our lives, whether it be changing our own individual patterns or changing patterns in our relationship or in our families to optimize our sleep, because it's really that vital for the quality and sustainability of our relationships.
Yeah, it's so interesting, isn't it? Why do you think that we are so strict in the way that we believe we should be sleeping. You know, like so many people are so against sleeping separately from a partner, or so many people are so against, certain times of day sleeping, certain circadian rhythms. Why do you think it's almost like something that we've linked to morality, right? It's so strange to me.
It's so true. And I think it's so interesting. Like, again, I always come back to like sleep is, really the most intimate of health behaviors. And yet we let all these sort of societal ideas sort of invade our minds about how we should sleep, I think in a much bigger way than we do for other health behaviors like diet or physical activity. I mean, of course, there's like rules of like how much, like what constitutes a healthy diet, what is the right amount of exercise and, types of exercise. But like we really allow sort of societal ideas and expectations to dictate sort of our assumptions and how we feel about sleep, instead of kind of really getting to the root of, okay, well, what's my sleep experience? And, how do I feel during the daytime? How do I behave, when I'm, sleeping well versus not well? And to be honest with you, in some ways, the sort of emergence and sort of the incredible sort of blossoming of sleep technology that now everybody has, in some ways, I think that's actually can be exacerbating the problem in some ways, because I think it's taking people even further away from sort of just having some own, individual insight of like, how well, did I sleep last night? Did I wake up feeling refreshed? Was I reaching for 4 cups of coffee? These are good sort of internal metrics to look to, but instead we're, focused on what our sleep tracker is saying. And it told me I had a terrible night of sleep, so it must be right. And I think, we need to sort of get back a little bit more to sort of having insight into sort of one's own experience, and really checking in with one's own values and expectations, and what's working and not working, at the individual and couple level, instead of sort of assuming that there are these sort of rules that are going to apply to everyone, because we all have sort of, different sleep needs and preferences, and we really need to find the strategies that are going to work best for us.
Absolutely. So interesting. Thank you so much for sparing me the time to chat, Wendy. I really appreciate it.
It's really been a lot of fun. I've enjoyed it. Thank you.
What a pleasure. So interesting. Hopefully you'll stop, everyone who's listening to this will stop thinking about the things that they should be doing and be thinking about the things that actually feel good and right to them, as we always encourage you to do here on That's Helpful. My guest today was Dr. Wendy Truxell. She's a licensed clinical psychologist, specially trained in sleep medicine, and a senior behavioral scientist at the Rand Corporation think tank. Her book is called Sharing the Covers: Every Couple's Guide to Better Sleep. There's so much more in there. If this is a real issue for you, it's kind of an area of sleep, like I said at the beginning, that I haven't really thought about. I've thought about the things that I do myself, but if you do have a partner or somebody in your house or somebody who shares your bed, this is going to be an issue for you. So it's definitely worth considering. I'll pop a link in the show notes to Wendy's book and where you can find her online and on social media, so you can check that out. Thank you so much for joining me. If you're enjoying the podcast, please leave me a review wherever you're listening. I really appreciate it, and it helps other people find our little self-improvement club. I'm Ed Stott. I sincerely hope that's helpful.